Okay, let's dive right into this really fascinating source document today. We're looking at a brilliantly crafted paper titled Test Everything, Catholicity as Universal Translation, Preservation, and the Stewardship of Human Witness. And what it does is propose a beautifully radical way to view global religions, philosophies, and yes, even secular worldviews. Instead of looking at them as competitors in some kind of zero-sum game, this text suggests we should actually view them as vital, hard-won pieces of human wisdom.
Which brings us to the core hook of this whole explainer. Think about this for a second. What if a religion's goal wasn't to erase its rivals, but to translate them? The author argues that true universality isn't about destroying differences, just to create a single, flat monolith. Not at all. Rather, it's about gathering and preserving. It's a completely different approach that asks us to look out at the diverse landscape of human thought and recognize that, hey, other traditions have spent centuries building wheels that already roll.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start by redefining the word universal, map out the translation method itself, look at 3 very different test cases, explore humanity's living archive, and finally wrap up with why this matters for tomorrow. Part 1. Redefining universal. Let's take a look at what the word Catholic actually meant originally.
Before it became an institutional boundary or just a demographic label, it literally meant according to the whole. The author outlines a really beautiful blueprint for this using a plain language summary called Angela's Explainer, which he actually wrote for his daughter. He says to think of Catholicity not as some strict gym teacher blowing a whistle and demanding everyone do identical spiritual push-ups, but instead think of it as a giant welcoming library. This library has its core texts, its chapels, its quiet corners. You can come in as far as you want. The lights stay on, the doors stay open, and the house welcomes an absolute multitude of voices.
So the crucial point here is redefining Catholicity itself. The text defines it as the universal capacity to receive, translate, preserve, and relate distinct human grammars without destroying their integrity. The foundational theological claim the author makes is that God is love, and love, by its very nature, presupposes a relationship. And you really cannot have a true relationship without genuine difference. If everyone is forced to be exactly the same, well, that isn't communion. That's just monotony. A true universal archive needs many distinct witnesses.
Contrast that fearful approach of erasing differences with the idea of actually gathering wisdom. Fear demands that we replace foreign ideas entirely, but gathering wisdom says, look, they've built a wheel that already rolls. Let's not reinvent it badly. Let's just keep it. Catholicity, in this view, doesn't become more universal by making the world less varied. It becomes universal by remaining available to the whole.
Part 2. The translation method. We know the goal is to gather, but how does that actually work? How do we practically map out this translation process without just, stealing someone else's concepts? Well, the author points out that this isn't some modern invention. We see historical precedents right in the scriptures. Jesus constantly used local metaphors, like speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well using the grammar of water, rather than demanding she abandon her history first. Paul, at the Areopagus in Athens, didn't smash the pagan altars. He noticed an altar to an unknown god and actually quoted their own Greek poets as a bridge. And then there's the Berean principle. The Bereans were praised because they eagerly received new ideas, but then carefully examined them daily against their own scriptures. They didn't panic, but they also didn't just blindly accept everything.
So here are the exact steps of the author's translation method. Step 1. Receive the tradition honestly, entirely without caricatures. Step 2. Identify the witness. What human problem did this tradition spend generations learning to address? Step 3. Translate that witness faithfully into a shared relational grammar. And step 4. Preserve the original. Notice something really important here. Identifying genuine differences and engaging in debate only happens after faithful understanding and preservation.
All right, part 3. 3 diverse test cases. Let's apply this theoretical blueprint to the real world.
Let's see how this works in practice, starting with Buddhism. Buddhists have spent centuries cultivating a highly refined examination of suffering. They use the word dukkha for the unsatisfactoriness of finite existence, and tanha for craving or attachment. Now, the translation method doesn't pretend Buddhism is just secret Catholicism. Instead, it translates the relational movement, recognizing dukkha as the reality of a fallen, restless humanity, and tanha as disordered attachment. We respect their generations-long study of suffering, and we preserve that wisdom. Next, we look at Taoism. The paper argues Taoism shouldn't just be reduced to some vague nature spirituality. It witnesses a profound grammar of harmony and non-domination. Take the concept of wu-wei, effortless action, or the wisdom of non-forcing. It isn't laziness, right? It's avoiding ego-driven domination. The author translates this into a shared relational language, docility to grace and acting in harmony with providence. Zhen Ren, the true person who lives beyond artificial striving, translates beautifully to the concept of the saint.
Our third test case is actually fascinating: atheism. The paper impartially treats lived atheism as a positive grammar too. It often carries a really strict commitment to intellectual honesty and a deep suspicion of false authority. The translation asks, what is this protesting? Well, often it rightly protests against coercive manipulation, weak evidence, and false gods. Catholic grammar translates this evidential rigor into the virtue of prudence and the refusal to worship unworthy concepts as an absolutely necessary rejection of idolatry.
Moving to Part 4, Humanity's Living Archive. The paper shifts to a striking real-world metaphor here.
To really ground this idea of preserving truth, the author introduces us to Edoardo Amaldi. He was an Italian physicist who worked alongside Enrico Fermi. When World War II scattered his brilliant scientific circle, Amaldi could have easily fled to the United States. But instead, he felt a profound duty to stay in a war-torn Italy, just to rebuild the science of physics. He understood that knowledge requires institutions, it requires memory, and requires stewards to protect it from being lost or weaponized.
Amaldi stated the only way to avoid the dangers connected with scientific progress is not to stop progress, but to ensure that it is used for peaceful purposes. This core belief that knowledge must be carefully protected across borders is a perfect mirror for the Church's archival instinct. Amaldi built houses for knowledge so the future inherited more than just ruins.
The Church, at its best, acts as humanity's ultimate pack rat. It gathers the fragments of philosophy, science, and foreign wisdom, kind of like monks diligently copying ancient manuscripts so that absolutely nothing true is lost in the span of history. It reminds us of when Jesus said after feeding the 5,000, "Gather up the fragments left over, that nothing may be lost."
And finally, Part 5, An Inheritance for Tomorrow. Let's explore the ultimate motive behind all this.
Why do we go through all this trouble to gather and translate? The touching analogy from Angela's explainer lays it out plainly. It is all for the children. Every single generation is born downstream from witnesses it did not create. We save all these different functioning wheels: the Islamic discipline of prayer, the Buddhist attention to suffering, the Taoist calm, the atheist demand for evidence, so the next generation simply doesn't have to rebuild human wisdom from scratch. We want to leave them a massive, beautiful library on well-lit shelves, not a pile of ashes.
The paper circles back to its foundational quote from Paul, "Test everything, hold fast what is good." The author brilliantly reframes this. It's not a suspicious warning telling us to be terrified of the outside world, but rather a spacious, open invitation. You are allowed to look, learn, and ask questions. Meet the world, examine it, learn exactly what it has carried, and hold on to the good.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative question. If we destroy the grammars of others, what inheritance are we truly leaving behind? If we burn the fragments, the children receive only silence. But if we preserve them, we pass on a world thick with memory and wisdom. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep gathering, and keep testing everything.